كلام في التصميم هو بودكاست من تقديم ليوان يستكشف مواضيع التصميم المعاصر في الشرق الأوسط وخارجه، ويربط أصوات المصممين المبدعين المحليين مع العالميين لتشجيع التعاون ومناقشة الأمور الإبداعية والثقافية والفكرية.
Talks on Design podcast by Liwan explores contemporary design themes across the Middle East and beyond. Featuring pioneering Qatari creators, the podcast connects local and global design voices and encourages collaboration and commentary on creative, cultural, and intellectual matters.
Hi Shourideh, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you for having me, Meera.
Thank you for being here with us today. I'm Meera Badran, and I'm excited to dive into our discussion under the theme of design and resilience. I believe this conversation is actually really coming at a time, at a moment where the work you do is becoming ever more critical every day, given the ongoing genocide and ecocide, as you point out, and as we'll speak about today as well, that's been unfolding in Gaza over the last 600 days now. And we are slowly almost approaching the 2-year mark in October. So thank you for being here with us today. I just want you to start, Shourideh, if you can, with an introduction of yourself, introducing forensic architecture, telling us about your background, your research, your writing, but also how you got into the work that you do today.
So I'm Shourideh Molavi. I'm currently a senior lecturer in human rights at Columbia University, but I've spent the past over two decades, working mainly in Palestine, across historic Palestine, focusing on topics of statelessness, border politics, migration, displacement. I started my work in Askar camp, Mukhayam Askar in Nablus in the West Bank around childhood education. From there, moved to the Heysha camp in Beit Jala, also in the occupied West Bank, looking at cultural heritage. And then I spent around 7 years working with Palestinian citizens of Israel. So the descendants of those Palestinians who remained on their land despite the forced ethnic cleansing of 1947 to 1949. And there I really learned a lot about Israeli nationality and citizenship regulations, the way that the Israeli political and legal system interplays between settler colonialism, apartheid, and military occupation to exclude this part of the Palestinian nation through citizenship. It really taught me a lot about how Israel works logistically and bureaucratically. And then for the past 10 years, I've worked not fully exclusively, but almost exclusively in Gaza. I've had the privilege of traveling there multiple times, including recently during this iteration of the genocide in Gaza. And there I worked mainly with journalists, Ain Media, which is a media center based in Balad Gaza in Gaza City, co-founded by my best friend, Rushdie Sarraj, who was very tragically martyred in October 2023. I also worked very intensely with farmers along the eastern perimeter of the occupied Gaza Strip. And also during the past 10 years, I've been the dedicated Palestine researcher at Forensic Architecture. Forensic Architecture is a research group. We're based at Goldsmiths University in London. We conduct visual and spatial investigations of state corporate violences, including environmental violences, longer historical violences. My role at FA is very different than the role of my colleagues in that I'm not an architect. My visual and spatial bandwidth is quite limited. I'm more a researcher, and I'm the only one at Forensic Architecture who has direct access to Gaza and to other parts of Palestine, other, of course, than our director, who's Israeli. At Forensic Architecture, my role has been to make sure that all of the projects that I lead, at least at Forensic Architecture, with a team there, are in direct conversation with groups on the ground, so that we are working directly with and or on behalf of Palestinian organizations on the ground in each of our investigations, making sure that we're answering questions that they want us to answer, that they need us to answer, not only ones that are interesting to the West or Western media demand. And I think most importantly, that whatever we produce is continue to be activated and mobilized by Palestinian organizations after they're launched. So it's not the case that we launch an investigation, we get an article in a mainstream Western newspaper, and it dies there. But actually that it's lived and that it continues and that it means something to the community or the family or the individual whom that violence we investigated affects. So this is my role, and as part of that role, I've been able to lead the founding of an office that we have in Ramallah at Al-Haq, which is the oldest Palestinian, and some say Middle Eastern civil society organization, human rights group in the world. It's our forensic architecture investigative unit office there, which is actually part of Al-Haq. And the most important part about this office is that it's Palestinians trained in forensic architecture's methods, leading investigations themselves with their own textures, with their own priorities and vocabularies. And that completely changes the way that our work is done, human rights work is done. Because when a Palestinian is investigating a shooting or an assassination of a Palestinian by the Israeli occupation forces at a checkpoint, they know that checkpoint because they walked through that checkpoint and they've driven through it multiple times. So they don't rely so much on aerial images or satellite images, they rely on memory, on what they felt. And that totally transforms and makes our method so much more political when Palestinians in Palestine engage in these methods. So that's, I think one of the best things, if not the best things that I've done at forensic architecture. And that's really my background. I mean, I do a little bit of everything, but I make sure that the work I do is actually wanted by the communities that I'm doing it on behalf of.
Amazing. And I have so many questions also about the methods you use, the meaning of witnesses, and actually using Palestinians, also giving them the ability and the role to be able to investigate their own kind of human rights violations and things that happen to them on ground is incredible. I'll also introduce myself briefly, and then we can start the conversation with forensic architecture and the methods that you use there before going into the research on your book as well, and plants and ecology too. I'm Meera Badran. I'm a Palestinian architect, researcher, and writer. My work has focused on the intersection between architecture, the human body, and the environment. So I think there is a few things that is similar to the work you do. I studied forensic architecture a lot when I was at university during my thesis work as well. My work looks mainly at the Palestinian context, and a branch of my research titled On Behalf of the Voice has looked specifically into digital biases that impact Palestinian bodies within occupied Palestine, specifically in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, looking at speech surveillance and the act of breaking down the Arabic language and the Palestinian dialect, and therefore through that the voice itself, and how the voice therefore then becomes a medium of control and detainment through the softwares that the Israeli government use to surveil and to translate. The work calls for Palestinians to find almost a form of resistance within the nuances of their language. But more recently as well, I've started a new branch of this research, and it's kind of continuing this On Behalf of series. So it was On Behalf of the Voice. Now I'm also looking on behalf of the land, which is exploring the Palestinian environment and placing the trajectory of Palestine actually within a history of colonized lands, and what that means as well. I explore its native plants, for example, the significance of plants for the Palestinian identity, for the Palestinian history, but also in that way, and I've looked at only a few at the moment, such as the cacti, where they actually also document testimonies or witness violence, massacres such as in 1948 in Deir Yassin. I'm also an architect at Qatar Museums' think tank initiative Qatar Blueprint, which is a national master planning tool. So I'd like to start by extending my deepest respect to the work you do, as you mentioned, as the lead Palestine researcher at Forensic Architecture, and the feat achieved in being able to do that, but also in your most recent book, Environmental Warfare in Gaza, which I actually have right in front of me, for the significance it brings. I think the work that you do for the first time is, it's not only documenting, recording, investigating, and then also disseminating war crimes, and not just for humans, but also for ecological rights too. And it's brought in a way where it uses different forms of investigative practices, the different methods of using law, academia, activism, oral testimonies, being on ground with the Palestinians there. Could you tell us more? And you started speaking about it a little bit on this way of working and how this has become such a powerful way of holding systems accountable today. And I'll add a second part to that question as well, which is actually, which you spoke about. It's not just about the role of investigating what happens and then putting that out to the world, but actually, how does that then aid the Palestinians there, and how does it continue to help them? How does it create that form of resilience for the people?
I really appreciate that and those kind words. The work that I do, I don't would certainly not. It does more learning than teaching. The work that I do. I've been very fortunate to have people be extremely generous with me. From a farmer being very generous, walking me through what the grain means to him, or more often to her, because it's mostly women who are leading the farming initiatives in Gaza, and also Bedouin women who are leading the farming initiatives, which is also understudied heavily. And through that, I learned that I learned to unlearn our counter-forensic methods. That the methods that, frankly, now everybody's relying on when it comes to Gaza, given the blockade, of satellite analysis and modeling and collecting testimonies, whether it's a situated testimony or not, relying on archival evidence, cartography, even critical cartography. All of these methods are important, and they, when you visualize settler colonial violence and ecocide, there is a space that opens up, a non-human space that opens up, where you learn from the memory of the land, and you learn from the seedling as a bio witness or a silent indicator of longer histories of colonial violence. So there's something that opens up there, but that's also, which is important enough, and there's already unlearning there, but it's also not enough, because if those methods are still answering a technical question, if those methods are still geared towards answering or clarifying a question that focuses on, when did Israel do this? How did Israel do it? Why did Israel do it? How did Israel frame doing it? For how long has Israel been doing it? What is the effect on the people? And is this legal? Is this illegal? How can it be argued? If it's still answering a question like this, then from the beginning to the end of the story, Israel remains the sovereign. Israel remains the power. It remains a voice of reason, even, because you're trying to show that here it acted irrationally. Whereas if the question that you're trying to answer is one that starts from the position that a settler colonial project like the State of Israel is an irrational project, is an anti-human project, is a dehumanizing project, then your counter-forensic methods will become secondary to a human experience. It'll be much more testimony-led. It'll be less geared towards activation in a particular forum, like a courtroom or a mainstream media piece. And it'll be much more concerned with how the community you're dealing with and you're working with processes the material, what it means to them. Maybe a beautiful map or a platform isn't very meaningful to them, but instead a report documenting their continuous presence on the land is more meaningful. In a context where all the archives are being burned, a report might be more meaningful for a farmer. or maybe getting the right to build a fence around their space is much more meaningful to them, in which case mobilizing the report in the courtroom makes sense for that reason, right? So it's less about the methods themselves, but it's more about how they're mobilized in relation to the needs of the community. And I think that's where my work is very different than, say, the work of all these visual investigative units that we're seeing sort of proliferate in the New York Times and in the Washington Post and Sky News, and to some extent even my organization, because I am not the visual one, certainly not in the office. I'm the one who has to explain often to the communities that I work with why things are possible, aren't possible, the process that we have to go through. And I think to my benefit or to my detriment, I also continue friendships and relationships. I mean, I have friendships and relationships from the very first project I did at Forensic Architecture 11 years ago that I still continue, to the point where I know certainly the person I work with, but their family and their kids, and you follow up, and all of this. Working with the community is messy. It's exhausting, especially as a woman in any context, as a young woman in any context, right? And but it's the thing that gives the work the meaning, not the findings themselves, and certainly not the forum and not the visibility that you get. And that's a constant struggle, because of course, when you're working in a team with people come from different positionalities, different educations, different lived experiences, and it can be extremely frustrating working with someone who's never been to this place, or who's been to it, who's even from there, but whose priority is visibility, or whose priority is impact, to a Western gaze, right? I mean, those moments are moments of extreme frustration. And my solution to that, my antidote to that, has always been to continue to shift my gaze to the people that I work with. And on behalf of, and take direction from them. So even if I think something is important, if people are telling me you can do that, but actually what's more important is this other thing, not just to defer always to the community, because sometimes I think the community is wrong. You have to also call people out on things, but to find a way to unlearn enough to understand why do they think this is more significant than the other thing that I know will have more impact, etc., visibility. So I think that's what gives any research that I produce value to me, and I've seen it also over time, to the point where this herbicide project that I led with a team at Forensic Architecture, it was in 2018 that we published it, and still it's being referred to, still it's being cited, and in a variety of forums, from galleries to newspapers to published books to courtrooms, and I think that is because of the framing of the project. And less about the findings of the project. I think if you carry these principles, because in the end they're political principles about what you value in terms of what you produce, that can bleed into any discipline and any practice. And I think that's more the compass that leads the kind of work that I do at Forensic Architecture and beyond, frankly.
Incredible. And I think that's something that I also wanted to talk about a little bit is, and you can tell me otherwise, is the way that forensic architecture kind of works always outside of that conventional space. With investigative research, you expect to always see it, say, in the courtroom, for example, but it moves into the art space, into the gallery space, into the cinema space. But also what I've realized through the work that I looked at is there's also creating dedicated platforms for specific projects for people to always be able to go back to them, whether that's a separate website or a report or a book, for example, that can always be referenced in the future. And how that is a form of resilience on its own. It's an ability to arm the researchers or the curators or the people on ground with these are the facts, and these are the images, these are the videos that can arm you with being able to explain the situation and show what happened in that moment. And I think you're right, and I think this is something I haven't thought about, is how actually the work is split into two. It's the let's disseminate and show and raise awareness to the people in the West or in other locations through galleries and cinema, but also how do we also make sure that this work that is raising awareness is making a difference to the people on ground, and how that creates a form of resilience. And I wanted to speak to you a little bit more about that. Like, how do you arm people on ground? There is the investigative process, which we'll come back to, because I have a question also about your teaching, whether that's at Columbia or teaching in Gaza, and helping people in that way understand the situations they're in. But also, how do you see it taking place in a way that's actually arming them? I just want an example, for example, that's helped a community use this information in a way.
So the work that we do arms or supports, empowers, mobilizes, whatever the word is that we want to use, communities in various ways. It's through, or it often is through lawsuits, right? The community knows something happened, they know how it happened, why it happened. Their testimony isn't enough because they're dealing with a colonial court or a neoliberal court, racist court, exclusive court in one way or another, whether this is in Palestine or in Colombia or in the Mediterranean area, etc. And we piece together the incident, showing as a layer, not just the testimony of the community, but also what satellite images tell us and what our model tells us and what the visual evidence tells us. And that, despite the violence that comes with the court as a forum, that's really important to people. That's what I realized also. I realized it 10 years ago when I was in Gaza documenting for the International Criminal Court. I remember then people literally telling me, we know the court is colonial, we know the court will never hold Israel accountable, but I still need you to exhaust this option. I still need to take this line until the very end, so take down my testimony. So they start by first pointing out all of the reasons, the historical and logistical and infrastructural reasons why this court will fail them, because they're less than human in the eyes of a European court, but they still want to exhaust this as an option. And when you talk to the Palestinian lawyers, they'll tell you it's either the rule of the law or the rule of the jungle. So before we get to the rule of the jungle, let's exhaust the rule of law. And those same lawyers today are at the point where they're saying, I'm afraid we might only have the rule of the jungle because clearly all of the legal avenues we mobilized have failed. So there is that this, and once some people are armed or empowered by having their 15 seconds in court, and feeling like a political subject. And I think this is very much an effect of colonial violence in our region, where we need our gazes to courtrooms in Europe and in the West for us to feel of value, of a full political subject. But then there's also moments that are much more granular. So when I was working in Gaza with farmers for the herbicide investigation, Israel, at the beginning and end of every harvest season, would send a civil aviation company to spray herbicides along the eastern perimeter of Gaza. I don't call it a border, it's a perimeter, a fortified perimeter. And it sprayed on the perimeter, not inside of Gaza, and waited for the wind to carry it in. It only sprayed on the days when the wind was going into Gaza, not when it was going out. So they would even check the direction of the wind by setting a wheel on a tire on fire. Is it going in Gaza? In very primitive ways, even. The military is more primitive than we are told. And they wouldn't announce it to the farmers, of course. So a farmer in the north of Gaza, in Beit Hanun, would see the planes, but they would start spraying from the north of Gaza all the way along the strip. And so what I set up there, for example, was, in a very simple way, a WhatsApp group among all the farmers who in the north aren't talking to the ones in the south. So the moment they start to spray in the north, the farmer would say spraying at 6 a.m. Farmers wake up at 4 a.m., and by the time it arrived to Shourideh or Sharq Jabalia, East Jabalia, those farmers had already covered their crops with tarps so that the poisons wouldn't land on their crops. So that was a very simple way of not so much informing the community, but linking the community, right? Because why would the farmer in Rafah go and talk to a farmer in Beit Hanun? They have, different priorities, different communities. And unlike what most people think, Rafah and Beit Hanun are extremely different culturally. There's a different accent, different stories, different jokes, different cuisines even. which have been erased over time with this colonial marking of Gaza as a strip. But there's that. And then there are also moments when I would take these NDVI maps, so maps that conducted remote sensing of the terrain to show the loss of greenery over time. And these are maps created by my colleagues at Forensic Architecture, the visual team, right, that like actually engages in these methods. They would pass them to me, and I would talk to farmers, and I would say, you know, between say January to March in 2010, did something happen on your land? And would say, no, I don't remember, you know, nothing happened. We've always been growing this crop. And I said, well, you know, I'm looking at the map and it's telling me that your land is feeling stress, that there was a loss of greenery in this period. And eventually it happened a few times when the farmer would remember, oh, yes, that's because they did a random airstrike on this farm. And then we had to go from eggplant to zucchini instead. So it was a forced change of cultivation crops. And those are really brilliant moments, because that was the memory of the land aiding the memory of the person, right? There was the moment when someone had forgotten a trauma that they had, really, because, you know, they most of the farmers I speak to treat their crops as if they're an extension of their family. In many ways they are, in the sense that it's part of their livelihood, it's part of their whole being. But it was a moment when it explained to them how they arrived to the moment they're arriving, where now they're growing zucchini instead of eggplant. So those are moments of, I mean, I don't know if I call it empowerment, but it is a moment when the people I've worked with learn about themselves more, so to speak, or learn about their reality more, the possibilities more. And it was also in those moments when they saw the value in the work I was doing. Because as often happens, when you would ask people questions about the disappearing trees in Gaza, they would look at me like, you're a political scientist, why are you talking about trees? I mean, even the local government in Gaza that pulled me into their offices a number of times to interrogate me about my intentions, they would say, you know, you're in political science, you're a professor at university, why are you talking about trees? And I would say, well, do you think the trees disappeared on their own? Did they just disappear on their own? And that was a moment of learning also for the government, local government, to say, okay, so it's political. Yes, of course, trees are political subjects. So anyway, those are really interesting moments for me. And I think as a researcher, they teach you how to engage with communities, right? They teach you what the community values, and that informs then the next project that you take on. Understanding what the priorities of the community is.
Yeah, I had a question actually here about that, about this kind of change in agriculture, depending on an airstrike, and actually how that is really a form of resilience as well. You highlighted and you spoke about the shift in the industry in Gaza from, say, citriculture of like oranges and olive orchards to strawberries instead. And you do this in multiple ways throughout the book, I also noticed. But what the farmers do is they ensure that crop continues to grow despite the Israeli colonialist entity almost making sure that crop does not grow anymore, whether through spraying of herbicide, uprooting trees during invasions. And this idea of resilience through the farmers, through their change of crop. Okay, this is no longer growing, but let's try this instead. Oh, that's no longer working. Let's try this instead, until they find the kind of fruits that are able to withstand everything that is going on around them. This is maybe a question for what's happening a little bit more now. I'm wondering what ways the farmers, if you know, what ways the farmers now are also trying to use this form of resilience, or what plants or what they're utilizing to ensure that food security and healthy crop continue to grow, such as, you know, using strawberries instead, for example.
Yeah, I mean, now we're in a totally different ballgame where all of the settler colonial preparation for a space where you can really tear a social fabric has reached its climax of extermination. I mean, the colonial logic has reached its logical climax, to the point where the entire eastern perimeter of Gaza is effectively flattened and scorched and made part of an extended buffer zone, so-called buffer zone, that includes entire cities, Beit Hanun, Shejaiya, Rafah, and soon to be Khan Yunis. But the farmers, when they, I mean, this is what I learned when I was in Gaza, that, you know, when they're displaced in a tent camp, they are essentially uprooted. You know, a tent, if you've ever been in a refugee camps don't have trees. They don't have parks for the most part. I mean, after 80 years, a Palestinian refugee camp will grow up a square, right, or a plaza, or maybe a garden. But for the most part, they don't have. You know, it's a concrete structure. And now in Gaza, it's a tented structure, nylon and plastic tarps. And that is extremely painful. Farmers and fishermen. Fishermen are another sort of group of people who have been also completely uprooted. In the north, in the port of Gaza, fishermen are still fishing, and Israel bombed the snake tail of the port of Gaza, the historical port of Gaza. But actually what that did was that it allowed the fish to travel in a different way. And so now they are finding slightly more fish within the nautical miles that they are able to go. Never safely, because of course there are always random attacks against fishermen and their vessels, especially now. With complete impunity by the Israeli Navy, occupation Navy. But farmers, when they go to these tent areas, I mean, it's extremely difficult for them to be in such close proximity. Usually they would wake up and, you know, communicate with the land. Is it cold? Is it hot? Do I need to spray water? How strong is the sun? In which direction is the wind? How are my crops doing? Now it's waking up and your immediate neighbor is another family from a different part of Gaza. You barely have space to breathe and move. But what you find is in the spaces in between tents, people are growing things. In the, you know, the quarter of a meter space, 2-foot space, people are growing things that are easier to grow, low-growing crops that yield quick output, need limited water, can rely on salty water. People are finding extremely creative ways of reusing you know, pasta to make flour out of it, to make bread, and also reactivating the, you know, over 40, 50 herbs and weeds in Palestine that the British tried to destroy in the 50s and the 40s and the 30s, that grow in the strip. You know, weeds are extremely easy to grow. They're weeds by definition, but they're also herbs. And in this way, people are resisting the insistence to continue to develop a connection with the land, a connection that has been reactivated because of the engineered famine and starvation, and reactivated in the sense that people are now working on the land. I mean, when I was in Gaza before this iteration of the genocide, very few young people would ever work on the land. You know, they were more city oriented. And it's all about al-ard in Palestine. And I thought, you know, what is the connection actually to the land now? Is it more in the memory or in the inherited generational memory? But now, mostly for worse, people are forced again to rely on the land because that's the only means of survival, or to risk their life going to one of these food destruction zones that the West has created to get a grain of flour. And I mean, that's the resilience, the insistence to continue to work on the land, even if it means growing things in sand and soil, and knowing that you know, the roots are very shallow, just as the roots of the tent is very shallow on the terrain. And I mean, historically, of course, the food security of Gaza was very reliant on that eastern perimeter because of the blockades. None of these are new struggles. The intensity of it is exponentially higher. The multifaceted and excruciating, sort of sadistic, psychopathic targeting of the social fabric of Palestinian life, period, it has reached genocidal levels until now unseen in history and inexperienced in history, never this well documented in real time ever. But the logics and the practices have histories that go as far back as the British Mandate. And they've only become more technologized, more abstracted, more surveilled, more militarized and fortified until they've reached their colonial logic of extermination that we see now. And so this is it. I mean, none of this is new, but it has reached a new level, both from the perspective of the violence that is being faced and from the perspective of how farmers and average civilians, you know, somebody who's a poetry teacher in the university now becoming a farmer because they have to survive. All of these are much older practices.
I want to just speak a little bit more on the plant before we move on how plants, and you mentioned it, is like the silent witnesses of violence, political subjects. I was recently looking at photos of the Deir Yassin massacre of 1948, another village in Palestine near Jerusalem, where I'm sure you know 100 civilians were killed in one night. And there's this photo I found on the Associated Press website of a cacti from the village, but with bullet holes pierced through it. And it's one of the first images I saw that started my interest as well in this idea of plants bearing witness and holding onto violence. Cacti live for over 100 years, if not more, and often don't heal from the marks that they get from scars. You know, people also often kind of write into them to keep a mark of their initials, etc. And therefore, these plants, they still could be there today as the living proof of this massacre from 1948, with these bullet holes still holding witness and holding space for that as well. And you highlight versions of silent witnesses of violence in environmental warfare in Gaza. And that's what it's dedicated to as well. The orange trees and the olive orchards, as we've mentioned. The leaves, I read somewhere where you were saying the leaves function like sensors recording memories of environmental destruction. I'd love to know more, as a kind of investigator and expert on this kind of level of detail that you also go into, the photos of the leaves, the scans of that kind of violence, of that destruction of the herbicide on the leaves. And what does it mean for these plants to hold witness? You know, what does it mean for people? What does it mean for the environment? And what does it mean also from a research perspective? And how do people also see that? You know, you spoke about the government in Gaza questioning you about that. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I mean, those leaves were, it's the first time that kind of study has ever been done in Gaza for a reason, because as difficult it is to get people out of Gaza, or for people in Gaza, Palestinians in Gaza, to move in and out. It's also as difficult to move a leaf out of Gaza, particularly in a way that is preserved and set up for testing. That study I did with Rushdie, who has been martyred since, and his then friend, later wife, who is still with us, now widow, Shourideh. And the three of us woke up at 5 a.m. We went to the Ministry of Agriculture, forced them to come with us that early, despite their desire, morally blackmailed them basically to take us there with their car so that we could pass. And we went to parts of the buffer zone that we were not permitted to go. I mean, we were shot at by snipers at the time, Israeli snipers, to get leaves, to access these leaves 2 days after an herbicidal spraying. And we went 200, 400, 600, 800 meters away in a very systematic way in two parts of Gaza, Juhr al-Dik and East Jabalia, and realized that within, say, 1,000 meters, you have 6, 7, 8 different types of crops being planted and grown, sometimes on top of each other. You would have eggplant crops on top of watermelon crops, on top of zucchini crops. And that, of course, is part of what gives the land stress. And that forced transition is something that farmers had to do because the market changed or the weather changed, or their land was bombed, or the herbicide killed one crop, but they weren't able to clean the land before growing another. And so it was a response to all of those things. But then when we looked at the leaves themselves, we could basically tell the story of Gaza by looking at the leaves. It was a response to salty water. It had insecticide. It's a zucchini leaf from a zucchini plant being grown on land that historically had orange and olive trees. Why are there no trees? Because Israel doesn't allow anything more than a meter to grow in the so-called buffer zone. So people had to cut down their trees. Many people also refuse to do so and repeatedly get bombed and missiles shot at their homes and on their lands. Those leaves also had scorched corners, which were a product of herbicide, and spots that are a product of herbicide traveling with the wind that was sprayed by the Israeli occupation forces. So from the leaf, I can tell you the story of settler colonial violence. I can tell you the story of apartheid, because if you move 200 meters on the other side of the eastern perimeter, those leaves by Israeli farmers are healthy. And those are leaves of trees that the Israeli farmers have. I mean, when you're walking from Gaza towards 48 Palestine, the first time you see a tree and you touch a tree is the tree on a farm that's maintained by an Israeli farmer. So Gazan farmers are looking at trees in their historic villages, but they themselves are not allowed to grow trees, a landscape that they're familiar with. And so in this way, the leaf told the story in a totally different way than a person would tell the story, because of course our bandwidths are limited as human beings. Memory gets hidden also with trauma that we don't often call trauma, of course. It becomes part of our daily life. It was a way to speak to that longer history, these leaves, these bioindicators, as I call them, the crops themselves, to speak to the longer history in a way that human beings couldn't. In a way that the farmer can explain why they're growing. They could explain why they're growing zucchini or eggplant, but they couldn't really explain when the transition was made from trees to that, because that was done by their great-grandparent, right? Or what specific reasons were, or if it came before or after a strike. And what's also fascinating about this is that it is also completely possible that the citrus industry in Gaza would have disappeared on its own, as it has in other parts of the Mediterranean. Climate change and neoliberal policymaking could have made it not lucrative, not sustainable, right? But that sort of healthy, or rather unhealthy because it's neoliberal, but that type of transition, organic transition, was never given an option for a population under settler colonial violence, right? It was always forced. And it continues to be forced. And in that same way, farmers are forcing it back. They're insisting on trees, they're insisting on citrus as a way to force it back. But that was never an option. So anything that we have in an engineered way, which means that all these bioindicators and the testimony from the leaves that I'm seeing, this is all intentional. I mean, that was the other thing. This leaf of the zucchini that I had showed and sort of tried to walk us through, all of its spots and its folds and its scorched corners were all engineered. It was somebody who decided it, budgeted for it, and implemented it over decades that led to the production of the leaf as such. And if I can say something quickly about the strawberry, I mean, yes, the transition was from citrus to strawberry, but the strawberry is even too old now. The latest thing in Gaza was a pineapple cultivation. Pineapple, and that also shocked me with farmers. I mean, I would say pineapples require a lot of water. It takes a full year to get a good pineapple. Why are you growing this? And they would say, well, because of the economy. I mean, if I export one box of pineapples, that's enough for me to live on for 6 months in Gaza.
Wow.
So it wasn't even for local production, because pineapples weren't eaten locally in the same way the strawberries weren't eaten locally, which tells you that, again, that transition could have happened naturally at some point.
Exactly. I mean, it takes a whole tree to bear one pineapple fruit as well. So yeah, that's very, very interesting. Eyal Weizman, in his introduction to the book, or in his foreword to the book, introduces the role of desertification through the eyes of the colonizer. This idea that what's happening in Gaza is in context of a colonial trajectory, which we have seen some of the methods of environmental violence taking place throughout history that we see in Gaza today. I want to kind of go into that a little bit and look at that kind of trajectory of the history that Gaza sits in today. Samia Hani, in her book Deserts Are Not Empty, defines the desert not just as its natural state, as being a desert, but actually its political state, as this idea that a desert could be a complete complex locus of climates and landscapes, but what they share in common are histories of resource extraction, anthropogenic exploitation, colonial dispossession, civil military occupation, and ethnic cleansing. And in some ways, you then see Palestine within that kind of definition of a desert. And it's to do also with kind of colonial history, with this idea that forests have been equated with civilization, and in turn, the opposite, which is the desert with the uncivilized. And therefore, it becomes acceptable for resource exploitation and destruction if this land is barren and fits with this colonial fantasies of the Jews returning to a dead and barren land, right? And we see this kind of use of the desert or the use of these lands that have been colonized in multiple ways, whether that's with nuclear testing in Algeria with the French, or the US on indigenous lands during World War II. We see it even with underwater nuclear testing today, where these kind of marine environments are completely neglected, with the idea that the sea is almost empty or lacking of life. And I wanted we could see this continuing today in Gaza in a completely new dimension. This idea that the people of Gaza and the people of Palestine are not worthy of life in general. They are not deserving of what the land also offers to them. And you speak of that through the kind of herbicides and the uprooting of plants and not being allowed to grow trees over a certain height. This idea that there is almost an asphyxiation, let's say. And I was watching a video on The Guardian that kind of really spoke to me, and it was with a Palestinian farmer who was actually speaking about the apartheid wall, kind of blocking him off the rest of East Jerusalem. And he describes the wall as choking. He says it's cutting them off from their life source. They built a wall which they claim is for security, is his quote. They built a wall which they claim is for security, but the wall just chokes, and it's slowly choking us all. And we see it, of course, in your research with these tactics of colonization as an asphyxiation of Palestinian life. You wrote a quote by Achilles Membe, if I'm saying his name correctly, of the economy of suffocation that colonial projects produce. Whether that's cutting natives from their land and food source, but also through, like, I was looking again at the body and this extension of how Israelis also the initiative of shooting to maim. So you are asphyxiating the body, you're stopping the body from completely being able to live while keeping it alive through surveillance, of course. And therefore, I wanted to ask you this question as a human rights scholar as well. I would love to hear more from you on these concepts of colonization through the lens of human rights. The right to have rights, not just in Gaza and Palestine, but also how the work you do and the research you disseminate can teach other oppressed people who are fighting for their human and ecological rights within their nations as well. And I see really Palestine as this kind of, it's becoming a reference book for people worldwide as well. Whether in India or other places who are consistently fighting ecological destruction, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I think Palestine is two things. I always say it like this. So you may have heard me say this in other interviews or in other pieces of writing. It's always two things, Palestine. One, it's a national liberation movement, an anti-colonial movement for Palestinians and their friends and their allies. And two, it's a lens. It's a lens through which we understand our own organization of time, our own organization of space. It's a lens that gives shape to our political principles, principles of dignity and justice and historical accountability, the right to have rights. And this is why often you find that when you do work on Palestine, in whatever context you're in, whether it's Zurich or New York or Stockholm or Marrakesh, that you very quickly learn what the limitations of the space you're in are. You learn the problems at home when you start working on Palestine. In whatever context, you learn that, oh, I can't say this, or I'm not allowed to access this square, or we have to fill in this extra form if we want to invite a speaker because it happens to be in Palestine. So Palestine sort of exposes or unlights the repressions at home. I learned this over decades of organizing around boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And in whatever university I was in doing it, I quickly learned how repressive my own society was, whether it was a Western society or not. So it's always those two things. And one thing that I think we have to be really careful of is making Palestine seem as an exception, because it's particular, right? It's specific. What's happening in Palestine isn't happening in the same way elsewhere at all. We had apartheid in South Africa, but apartheid is a crime that can be committed by any state, any authority. And the apartheid in South Africa is not the apartheid in Palestine. It's a different kind of apartheid, right? It's an apartheid that's interlaced with settler colonialism and with military occupation in the historic Palestine, from the river to the sea. It's which means that in Haifa, which is in so-called Israel proper, in 48 Palestine, you still have apartheid and settler colonialism and military occupation, but at different percentages, right? They're gauged differently. So Palestine has a specificity, but it's also part of a longer history of practice. And very recently, I realized this, and was speaking with a friend who was telling me about the Sri Lankan extermination of the Tamil population in the 90s. What the Sri Lankans did in the 90s was slaughter people en masse, women and children, and they began by targeting hospitals and medical points, and they initiated a campaign of starvation. And interestingly, the weapons that they used were weapons that they purchased from Israel, right? So I mean, in terms of the links, right? So Israel developed those weapons because it practiced them on Palestinians. It has this whole like cyber weapons and weapons industry that is a product of its own military occupation and settler colonial violence. But that gets exported, and when that gets exported elsewhere and practiced, that knowledge comes back to Israel, right? And by extension to Western states. So what's happened in Gaza recently, I say it's the past and the present and the future collapsed. Gaza is a collapses time, because it's a product of a longer history of dehumanization that's taking present today, but it's also a rubric for states and actors on how to exterminate a population. So we will see in the next war hospitals being the first target, because it's an effective way to exterminate a population. Target their agricultural sites, target their food supplies, their bakeries. If you're looking to exterminate the population, children first, they have to become the target. Women for reproductive purposes. If you're going to target young men, target them in their groin area, which is exactly what Israel is also doing. I mean, these practices are rubrics for how future wars will be fought against Black and brown persons. And in that sense, the world is learning from Palestine. Allies of Palestine are learning about the limitations of international spaces, human rights spaces. So they're learning about the limitations to courts, the exceptions that are made for Israel. And not because Israel is Israel or Israel has a Jewish majority population, right, which increasingly is questionable, but because Israel is an extension of the West, because Israel is part of the European exception, and because of Israel's particular placement within European and white Western psyche, right? That's the only reason why there is a protection for Israel. And Israel is exercising all of its violations with full support and resources and empowerment from the Western states that placed it there, who themselves were doing this to colonize peoples for decades, for a century, now are not, but now are empowering Israel to do so. right? So for the allies of Palestine, Palestine becomes a lesson in the limitations to our human rights spaces and the need to never only mobilize one forum. We can't only rely on the court. We have to rely on the court and the street and the gallery and the university and the press. We have to mobilize all of these forums because they're all going to fail us in one way or another, and the community, right? And they all will have limitations. As I said, working with the community is messy and it has its limitations, and the community, is often 3 steps ahead but 2 steps back still. So I think that's a lesson for the allies. For Palestinians or for colonized peoples, so there are different layers of lessons, right? For the West, there's a lesson of how to enact this colonial violence in these warfare in the future. For the allies of Palestine, it's the limitations of our forum. And for Palestinians and other indigenous populations around the world, it's really a lesson on the kinds of wars to come. And this is why when we're looking at the solidarity that we're getting, I mean, indigenous people around the world were the first to express solidarity for Palestine because they've lived it and they know this is coming, right? We know, people of color know that this is the violence that's going to be on our bodies for those of us outside of this geographic unit. So it's a lesson, and it's really a learning moment in the most horrific way. It's a learning moment for all of us, and those of us who know what we are looking at are justifiably hysterical and enraged and unable to sleep and eat and have a bad taste in our mouth constantly. Even when we're smiling, we're grinding our teeth because we know what we're looking at. We know what is to come. Unless this stops now, and even if it stops now, it will take 2 generations to undo the trauma and the violence and the scorching of the earth that has been produced in such a short period of time. And I think, as a human rights scholar, I look at this understanding full well the limitations of human rights as a discourse in the forum, but those were limitations that already existed and that are only made clear in a context where they should be activated. The courts should be able to say stop and states respond. We know that they didn't because they hadn't in other contexts, but this is a reactivation of what we knew. So it's horrific, and I always say also it's a vindication in the most horrific way. I knew this was going to happen in this way. You knew, those following you, Palestinians knew it would happen in this way, which is why they've been beating their chest saying, stop it, stop it, stop it for 8 decades. Even before the Nakba, I went to the archives, the UN archives in Geneva, League of Nations archives, and there you would have telegraphs from every single civil society sector you can imagine in all of historic Palestine, from the Arab Women's Union in Nazareth to the Farmers Association in Jaffa, saying, stop the Zionist movement in our country. In the 30s, they were writing the League of Nations, saying, stop it. This will totally destroy this land. This will create a system of hierarchical domination that didn't exist before. Don't allow for the state to be declared in this way. Don't displace us. People knew this for more than 8 decades, right? And those of us who know what we're looking at are beyond enraged for this very reason, because we're realizing the level that things have gotten to and the failure of these institutions, and if we wait 5 years, we'll really everyone, the whole world, right, will pay the costs for what the West has allowed to happen.
I want to go back to that a little bit, where you mentioned the archives, the UN archives. This reminded me of something. I had it as a question, and then it just reminded me of it, and I think we can go back to it. Is what happened in the 30s and the 40s with the Zionist movement in Palestine, but then also, of course, the Nakba of 1948. Everything we've spoken about today is a Nakba of the present. It's an ongoing Nakba. It hasn't stopped. We speak about it as 1948, 67, and now as these kind of 3 major events, but it's a kind of a continuation. It's a cycle of history that hasn't stopped. It's a continuing thing. And I noticed in your work, you spoke about and you investigated the mass graves and massacres in Tantura and Al-Duwaimi, where to investigate and to identify the locations of these mass graves from these massacres during the Nakba of 1948, which now is over 75 years ago, your main form of evidence and aid is really the Palestinian survivors, the memories, the archives that they hold, their witness testimonies. I wanted to ask you about these. I think it's a nice way to also anchor today and the work that you're doing today with kind of this research that you've been doing onto the Nakba of 1948 and the massacres that happened then. Could you speak more on that and what it means to also identify the locations of these mass graves today? What it means for the families of those who have been killed, but also what it means to find these locations under Israeli settlements that exist in the houses and etc.
Yeah, so they were very different projects because there's one Nakba. Nakba is a strategy. It's also a historical event, but it played out very differently in different villages. It played out differently in Tantura because Tantura was wealthier and was more developed culturally, had more civil institutions. It was more connected to spaces outside of historic Palestine because it was a port. It had a port and it was more connected to the sea. Whereas Dawaimi was more a pastoral village, less political organizing, and was more defined by the vegetation than by built up infrastructure. And that came out when I spoke with witnesses of these massacres and mass graves. Because, of course, when you speak to a witness, in the case of Tantura, we spoke with Adnan Yahya, who was a teenager at the time of the occupation and forced depopulation of Tantura, but who was also forced to participate in the burial, the mass burial of his fellow villagers, including some who were still alive at the time when he was forced to bury them as a child, and by the Zionist forces that invaded his city, his town. And so his markers were things like the Sweetwater well, the main square, the school, the islands, right? That the 4 islands that surrounded Tantura. Whereas in the case of Dawaimi, it was more for Abu Bassam, who was 10 years old at the time of the massacre. He lost most of his family at the massacre at Tur al-Zaq. The markers were the hills and the valleys and the type of vegetation and the caves and the latoons, the kilns that existed there. So it pushed me to really unlearn how I conduct interviews and how I approach the city. I mean, we talk about the Nakba as this one thing. We talk about Palestine as this one place and Palestinian villages. Well, they were depopulated in very different ways, in the sense that the people who fled them remembered their villages based on totally different markers, and in the sense that the villages themselves they were themselves a full dimension and diversity of references, stories, cuisines, accents, attitudes, conservatisms, links and perspectives, desires, dreams. I mean, they were totally different personalities, each of these villages, that can only be expressed by a survivor, right? And so that was it. But the project itself started because there was an initiative by the survivors, the children of the survivors of those massacres, who wanted to understand where the bodies were buried. And this came out when I spoke to Israeli historian Ilan Pape, incredible anti-Zionist scholar and public intellectual, who basically said, we talk about massacres, but we don't ask the question of what happened to the bodies, where are the bodies buried? And the moment you ask that question, then you have to talk about 1948. So the case of Tantura in particular was significant because you couldn't go to an Israeli colonial court and say, in 1948, there were massacres and the bodies were buried here. All we could say was, we believe that this is a grave site, sometime between 1947 and 1949, because those were the aerial images we had at the time. There's a grave site that shows here. There are bodies here. Therefore, this land is sacred. We don't say how they arrived. We don't talk about Zionism, settler colonialism. And we need this land, the coordinates that mark the corners of the grave to be marked off. because it's sacred, right? We don't say anything else. But even the act of marking them off means that something happened. Everybody knows what happened. I mean, even the biggest, Zionist denier knows what happened and justifies it and says, yes, but we had to do it because X, Y, Z. So that's how it started. And I thought that the lessons that I learned from Tantura, I could apply to Dawaymi, and then realized, no, Dawaymi is this totally different personality. So I had to learn new skill sets and new vocabularies, and not just new Arabic terms, but fallaha terms, like farmers terms that even Arab linguists that I would approach, when I would ask them, like, I don't know what this, I never heard this word in Arabic before. What does it mean? And even they would say, wow, this is really a specific, phrase that you would only hear from specific farmers in this part of Palestine. And I think it could be X, Y, Z. Even their guesses as a linguist was a percentage wrong, because even they didn't know. So it just tells you the amount of richness that was erased and uprooted and lost, and still somehow is hanging between the heaven and the earth, and it's up to us to catch it. But doing this project in the first year of this iteration of the genocide in Gaza was significant, because Dawayma is Gaza, and Gaza is Dawayma, and is Tantura, is Deir Yassin. Again, in very different ways and in very different intensities, but it's the same. And the things that we don't have in Dawayma or in Tantura, we don't have footage of women and children being massacred. We don't have videos of this. We have photos of men being led, and we have photos of women and children separated from the men. But we don't have photos of them actually being shot. We have that material when it comes to Gaza now, or Jenin, or Tulkarem. We have them now. And the voids from 1948, the things that we don't know in 1948, those holes are being filled with what we have in Gaza now, and vice versa. If people don't understand how the Palestinians get so dehumanized, how could we allow to see a child on a bicycle driving on a road and a missile shoot him from the sky, right? How is this possible? Well, that makes sense if you understand what happened in Dawayma, where Israeli soldiers at the time, and that was Israel because it happened in October 48, literally bashed children in the head with clubs in what was described by another Israeli soldier as Nazi-like acts, right? They themselves called it Nazi-like acts in their documentation. So were no secrets, right? And those voids in Gaza, the questions that even those of us who are following Palestine very closely or who are Palestinian know, how can we arrive here? Well, you can arrive here because look at what happened in Dawayma. Look what happened in Tantura. Those are the longer histories. And I think so it only made sense to talk about Dawayma when this iteration of the genocide is happening in Gaza. It only makes sense to bring in Gaza when I'm talking about Dawayma. And I think that was very important for me, and it allowed me to have a broader bandwidth and to step out of the situation and sort of limit the hysteria that was around me of, making it seem as if this is a one-time thing. This is a particular response by a very right-wing settler Israeli government. No, you can have the most left-wing government and it's still the same logic of extermination if you have the same structures at play. So anyway, that's sort of where it came from, and I'm quite thankful for the generosity of the witnesses to us, to myself and the team that I worked with, who themselves are re-traumatized by this. I mean, you talk to Holocaust scholars and you talk to Nakba scholars, and you see how re-traumatized they are from this iteration of the genocide in Gaza. They see themselves in it.
My last question is about teaching, and it's about this idea of, resilience for the future and arming future generations. You teach at Columbia University in New York, and at Forensic Architecture is also based in Goldsmiths University in London. You speak about teaching Palestinians to use investigative resources in Palestine, but also in the book you mentioned the workshops you did with students in schools in Gaza. On the methodologies of documenting environmental violence. I just wanted to kind of end it with having you speak a little bit more to what teaching means to you, and what it really means to educate and teach these future generations the ability to learn investigative process and use them as a form of resilience as well.
Yeah, I mean, teaching is learning to me. If I'm not learning from my students, then I'm not teaching properly. And I think as of late, teaching has become difficult in Western institutions, because in order to teach, you have to have a level of trust, right, in the room, and in the context where instructors and people of conscience are being surveilled and harassed and demonized and doxxed, sometimes also by their student participation. That becomes increasingly difficult, to impossible, frankly. I think in my classes, I've been extremely fortunate to have students who come knowing my research profile, come knowing the sort of the basic anti-racist principles that we start and frame every conversation with. I make it very clear in my classroom that it's not my job to activate an anti-racist politics, but everybody has to be vigilant. And when you say something that erases someone's experience, we stop the conversation and we address it. But the reality is that regardless of people's political positions, they are committed to the material of the course. And the material of the course is anti-racist material. And that's sort of how I frame it, that if you want to take my classes, these are the materials that we're looking at. If you're not interested in the materials, go to another course. And so there's also this understanding. And I have found that particularly since this iteration of the genocide, particularly in the context that I'm teaching in the US as well, a space that is very new for me to teach, and I've never taught in America before now, the classroom has become a sacred space, a space where students have repeatedly expressed feeling safe. And I mean safe not in the postmodern way of, I feel harassed without touch. I mean literally safe to speak and not be kicked out, not be snatched, not be deported potentially, not have their degree revoked, because they know that what they're saying in the classroom isn't producing permanent media and is within a framework of anti-racism. And that is important to me. And I've also been fortunate to have very supportive and similarly committed colleagues who come from very different contexts. I think everybody is realizing how high the stakes are, even if they're not working at all in Palestine. I mean, this is the second function of Palestine that I mentioned, that it's a lens through which to understand the repressions at home. People who didn't know anything about Palestine are realizing that they cannot say certain things in their classrooms, and that's bothering them. Parents who themselves were, for example, involved against the Vietnam War and sent their kids to Colombia, realizing that their kids can't protest on the same steps and in the same halls that they protested in. So even if they don't care, they don't think Palestinians are human, they see something happening to them, right? So it's as difficult as it is, and as frankly terrifying it is, because I also have a child and I'm in New York City at Columbia, where colleagues and students are going missing, being disappeared. It's also the right moment to be there. It feels like the right moment to be there. It feels also that there is an urgency to defend the space of the classroom. So when I teach, and I know when my colleagues in my institute teach, I'm engaging very little with the institution itself, but more with my colleagues, with my students, and in my classroom space. And I think that's sort of the approach that we've all taken that allows us to continue. But it's also how you build a movement. It's also how learning happens, right? Not in the meta scale, but in the more granular level of, let's try to have a conversation about this one text and keep our finger on the text, and then understand why that text is urgent for us to understand in this moment that we're in. So teaching has become extremely, as I said, difficult to navigate, not just for us as instructors, but also for students. And I think what I really appreciate also is seeing how students view their education as an extension of their organizing, as an extension of their political work. I mean, the same students who are organizing events and protests on campus are the students who are consistently submitting their papers on time, submitting their MA thesis. I mean, they don't see a contradiction between the two. in a way that, say, my parents' generation saw a contradiction when they were involved in the Iranian Revolution. They would sacrifice their studies for their political work, and students today are seeing that as an extension of their political work, their studies, which I think, is a new lesson that my generation can learn from them.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I hope the best for your teaching and for everything that's coming. For all the work that you do, thank you. As a Palestinian as well, and as an architect, it means a lot also to me to be able to navigate, my emotions, but also the situation and everything that's been happening through the work that you do, whether that's through environmental warfare in Gaza, but also through forensic architecture. So thank you on behalf of all the students and architects and Palestinians as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Meera. It's a pleasure to talk to you. It's also a pleasure to find someone with whom you can have an honest political conversation, right? These spaces are hard to find. So I'm glad you're cultivating the space and defending it. Thanks for your work.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Shourideh. Thank you very much.